"Excuse me, sweetheart, but I think you're confused." The voice cut through first class like a blade dragged across glass. Delaney Ashworth didn't look up. Didn't need to. She'd faced worse than an entitled stranger in a $6,000 suit. "Be a good girl," he sneered, snatching her boarding pass from her hand. "Head back to economy before I call someone." She said nothing, just breathed, the way she'd been trained to right before everything changed. Then his hand closed around her bag strap, and something ancient woke up behind her eyes. What that man didn't know, what nobody on that plane knew, was the truth hidden beneath her sleeve. A tattoo, a trident, a gold star earned in a place with no name, dragging a dying brother through darkness that should have killed them both. He was about to find out exactly who he'd just called sweetheart, and by the time the captain saw her shoulder, it would already be too late to take it back. Part 1. The alarm didn't go off. It never had to. 4:47 a.m. Delaney Ashworth's eyes opened to the ceiling of her rental house in Coronado, and for exactly 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. That was the ritual. 3 seconds of nothing. 3 seconds where the ceiling could be anywhere. A safe house outside Kandahar. A tent in the high desert. The floor of a transport plane with her cheek pressed against a rucksack that smelled like gun oil and someone else's sweat. Then the ceiling fan clicked into focus. White paint. A water stain shaped like Florida. Home, she exhaled, long, slow. Through the nose, the way they'd trained her to control her heart rate before a breach. Except now the only thing she was breaching was a closet full of clothes she barely wore. Because that was the joke nobody got. The joke where a woman could clear a room in under 4 seconds, could put 2 rounds through a 2-inch gap in a doorframe from 30 meters in the dark, and still stand in front of her own closet at 4:50 in the morning wondering if the blue top was too much. Too much for what? A flight. It was just a flight. She sat up, bare feet on hardwood, cold. Grounding. Another trick. An old one. Feel the ground. Feel the temperature. Prove to your own nervous system that you are here and not there. The tattoo on her shoulder blade caught the hallway light when she passed the mirror. She didn't look at it directly. She never did. Habit. Some things you carried and some things you looked at, and those were not the same category of thing. Packing took 4 minutes. It always took 4 minutes. 1 duffel. Rolled clothes, not folded, folded wasted space. A shaving kit that had nothing to do with shaving and everything to do with muscle memory, the exact same items arranged the exact same way they'd been arranged for a decade, because a body that has been ambushed once does not trust a body that has not double-checked its own gear. Her dress uniform hung in a garment bag on the back of the door. She didn't touch it yet. Touching it too early felt like inviting the ceremony into the house before it was time, which was stupid, superstitious, which she knew, which didn't stop her. The phone buzzed on the counter while she made coffee she wouldn't finish. Cole Boone, 4:58 a.m. You up? She smiled before she even typed the reply. Something about his texts always did that, cut straight past the armor, found the version of her that existed before all of it. Always up. You're the one who's supposed to be resting. Tell that to my leg. It has opinions. At 4 a.m. Delaney set the mug down. Looked at the wall for a second. The leg. 2 years and it still came up in every conversation like a third person in the room. Uninvited. Permanent. I'm swinging by before my flight. She typed. Don't argue. Wasn't gonna lie. You know me too well, Chief. She stared at that word longer than she meant to. Chief. 4 years since her promotion, and it still landed somewhere strange in her chest. Half pride, half a debt she wasn't sure she'd finished paying. She grabbed the duffel, left the coffee, didn't look at the uniform hanging on the door. The drive to the VA facility took 11 minutes at that hour. Streets empty, the ocean somewhere off to her right, doing whatever the ocean did before sunrise. Indifferent, endless. The same water that had nearly swallowed half her training class a decade ago and didn't remember any of them now. She parked. Sat in the car for a second longer than necessary. Because there was a version of this morning where she skipped the visit, went straight to the airport, avoided the particular ache of walking into a rehab wing and seeing a 220-pound mountain of a man reduced to careful, deliberate steps on a treadmill with handrails. Except she never skipped it. Not once. Not since the cave. Not since the vent shaft. Not since she dragged 300 pounds of dead weight and shrapnel and terror across open ground, while something screamed behind her that she was fairly sure had been her own voice. She got out of the car. The nurse at the front desk knew her by now. Didn't ask for ID anymore. Just nodded toward the east wing and said, "He's cranky today, fair warning." When isn't he? Cole Boone was sitting in a wheelchair by the window. When she found him, not because he needed the chair anymore, not really, but because the physical therapist made him use it between exercises, and he complained about it the way some men complained about their in-laws. Constant, theatrical, secretly fond. He looked up. The grin came fast, easy. The same grin that had once talked 3 separate commanding officers out of court-martialing him for offenses that were, in his own words, morally justified but tactically unwise. "There she is," he said. "The president's favorite paperweight. I'm not a paperweight. You're about to stand very still in a very shiny room while a man pins something on your chest. That's a paperweight with extra steps." She dropped into the chair across from him, unbothered, because this was their language, had been since the desert. Sarcasm as a life raft, humor as the only thing strong enough to hold weight that heavy. "How's the leg? Rude of you to lead with that, Cole." He exhaled. The grin didn't vanish, but it thinned. Cost something to hold on to it, and she watched him pay that cost the way. She'd watched him pay 100 smaller ones since the extraction, since Landstuhl, since the year of surgeries that had turned a soldier's leg into something reconstructed out of titanium and stubbornness. "Getting there," he said. "Slower than I want. Faster than the doctors expected. So somewhere in between hell and a miracle, which feels about right for my life in general. You'll walk into that ceremony." "I'll walk into that ceremony," he agreed. "Wouldn't miss it. Not after what it cost to get you there." Silence sat between them for a second. Not an empty silence. A full one. The kind 2 people share when they both remember the same 20 minutes of their lives in a level of detail no therapist has ever fully gotten out of either of them. "You still have the dreams," he said. "Not a question sometimes." "The vent shaft?" "Sometimes." He nodded slowly. Understood better than anyone alive what that particular loop of memory did to a person at 3 in the morning. The tightness of stone against both shoulders, the total absence of light, the certainty, for one specific unbearable stretch of seconds, that she would die wedged in rock while men she loved bled out 30 meters away. "You did good," he said. Quiet now, all the sarcasm gone out of it. "You know that, right? Whatever the dreams tell you at 3 a.m. You did good." Delaney looked at her hands. "I got lucky." "No." His voice sharpened, just slightly, just enough. "Don't do that. Don't you dare do that today of all days. You trained for 6 years to be the only person small enough to fit through that gap. That's not luck, Chief. That's you. That's the exact specific thing you are, and I am walking into that ceremony on a leg that only exists because of it, so don't you dare call it luck in front of me." She looked up, something tight behind her eyes that she refused on principle to let out. "Okay," she said. He echoed. Then softer, the grin sneaking back in at the edges. "Now get out of here before you make me cry in front of the nurses. I have a reputation." "What reputation?" "Devastatingly handsome. Extremely stoic. You cried during a dog food commercial last week. That was a good commercial." She stood, squeezed his shoulder on the way past, the way she always did, the touch saying the things neither of them had the architecture to say out loud. "See you in D.C., she said. "Save me a seat," he called after her. "Preferably one nobody tries to steal." She laughed. Actually laughed, the sound surprising her a little on the way out the door, because she had no idea, standing in that hallway, with the sun just starting to come up gold through the windows, how close to prophecy that joke would turn out to be. San Diego International at 6:40 in the morning had a particular texture to it. Fluorescent light doing its best impression of daylight. The low hum of 100 rolling suitcases. Coffee smell fighting a losing battle against jet fuel drifting in from outside. Delaney moved through it the way she moved through every unfamiliar space, which was to say, Not the way most people moved through it at all. Exits first. Always exits first. 3 of them visible from where she stood at the security line, filed away, without conscious effort, the way another person might notice the color of the walls. Then the crowd itself, sorted automatically into background and foreground, most of it noise, most of it nothing, except for the 2 places her eyes kept returning to without her permission. A man near the coffee kiosk, whose jacket sat wrong across the shoulders, like there was something under it. He didn't want printing through the fabric. She watched him for 4 full seconds before he pulled out a laptop bag from under the jacket, and she let the tension go, quietly, privately, the way she let go of 100 false alarms a week that nobody around her ever knew were happening, because that was the tax. Nobody talked about the tax. They talked about valor, about medals, about the parts of it that photographed well. Nobody put a camera on the part where a grown woman stood in a coffee line, doing threat assessment on strangers buying oat milk lattes because 6 years of training had rewired something in her that peacetime hadn't figured out how to undo. The second man was harder to explain, even to herself. Older, 70s, maybe, standing near a departure board with a small canvas bag at his feet, and a posture that Delaney recognized before her conscious mind caught up to why. Spine too straight for his age. Shoulders squared out of habit rather than effort. A veteran's stillness, the specific kind that comes from a body that spent years being told exactly how to hold itself and never entirely unlearned it. She didn't approach him. Wasn't the moment for it. But she filed him too, the way she filed everything, and moved on toward her gate. Security took 11 minutes. TSA agent glanced at her ID, did a small double take at something in the system flagged against her name, said nothing, waved her through with a look that suggested he'd been told not to ask questions and had decided, wisely, not to. The gate area for Flight 492 to Washington, Dulles, was already filling in by the time she got there. She found a seat near the window, duffel between her feet, and let herself, for one small stretch of minutes, do something close to relaxing. Except relaxing wasn't quite the right word for what her body did. It was more like idling. Engine running low, ready, watching the room reflected faintly in the window glass instead of watching it directly, a trick that let her track movement without appearing to. Her phone buzzed again. Mom. You have everything, sweetheart? Passport. Dress uniform. The good shoes, not the scuffed ones? Delaney smiled despite herself. Her mother had spent 28 years, alternately, terrified of and fiercely proud of the daughter who'd walked out of small-town Ohio at 18 and never really walked back, and that particular blend never quite resolved itself into anything simple. Got everything, Mom. Even the good shoes. Your father wants to know if the president shakes hands or salutes. Both, probably. He's going to cry. I'm just warning you now. You're going to cry. I already cried this morning making his eggs. Don't tell him. Delaney laughed quietly to herself, the sound almost lost under the gate announcement, calling for early boarding, and typed back a heart, because some things didn't need more words than that. Then she looked up, and the flight attendant, working the gate podium, was saying something about first-class priority boarding, and Delaney gathered her bag and stood, and somewhere in the recycled air of the jet bridge, ahead of her, though she had no way of knowing it yet, Garrett Kingsley was already 3 drinks into a morning that had convinced him the entire world existed to accommodate his convenience. Seat 3A had a particular kind of quiet to it, the quiet of first class before a flight fully loads, when the cabin still belongs mostly to itself. Delaney settled in by the window, stowed the duffel, pulled a paperback from her bag, something worn and dog-eared, the kind of book you carry not because you're currently reading it, but because the ritual of carrying it means something. She didn't open it right away, just held it. Let her shoulders drop half an inch, the closest she came most days to something like peace. The cabin filled slowly around her. A businessman 2 rows back, already on a call he clearly thought was more important than it was. A young couple in matching cardigans arguing softly about whether they'd left the stove on. The ordinary music of ordinary people going about ordinary mornings. She opened the book, read exactly 1 paragraph, And then a voice cut across the cabin like a blade dragged across glass, and the paragraph dissolved out of her memory the second the words hit her. "Excuse me, sweetheart, but I think you're confused." She didn't look up right away. Neutrality first. Assessment before reaction. "The economy section," the voice continued, dripping with something that wasn't quite condescension and wasn't quite disgust but lived somewhere uncomfortably close to both, "is back past the curtain." She turned. Slowly, deliberately. A man stood in the aisle, charcoal suit, the kind that cost more than her monthly rent, tailored close enough that it had clearly been fitted for a body that had since added a bit of weight the tailor hadn't been informed about. Tumbler of something amber in one hand, boarding pass in the other, tapping against his thigh with the impatience of a man who had never once in his adult life been made to wait for anything. Garrett Kingsley, though she didn't know his name yet, wouldn't for another few minutes. All she had right now was the shape of him, the particular flavor of entitlement that had a smell all its own, cologne and scotch, and the total, unshakable certainty that the world had been built specifically to serve him breakfast. "I believe I'm in the correct seat," she said. Calm, even. The exact register she'd used 100 times before, in rooms far more dangerous than this one, because she'd learned a long time ago that calm unsettled certain kinds of men more than shouting ever could. He didn't sit, didn't move his bag from where it blocked the aisle, just looked around the cabin instead, searching for an audience, and found a businessman in 3B desperately trying to disappear behind a tablet screen. "Did you hear that?" Kingsley asked the empty air. Nobody answered, which didn't stop him. "Listen, honey." He crouched slightly, the way a person might crouch to speak to a child or a dog, and something in Delaney's spine went very, very still. "I don't know who you smiled at to get past the gate agent. I don't know if you're hoping nobody notices you snuck up here. But this is first class. This is for people who pay for it." She reached into the seat pocket without a word, retrieved her boarding pass, held it up. 3A, printed plainly, not ambiguous in any way. He snatched it out of her hand, which he shouldn't have done, which was the first small mistake of many he was about to make, though he had no way of knowing that yet, staring down at a piece of paper like it was written in a language he refused to learn. "System error," he announced, tossing it back into her lap like it had personally offended him. "I'm a Platinum Key member. I fly this route weekly. Seat 3A is my seat. It's always my seat." "Is it?" she said. Not a question, a flat observation, delivered with the specific stillness of someone who had spent a career learning that the quietest voice in the room was often the most dangerous one. He didn't catch it. Men like Kingsley rarely did. "The app probably glitched," he continued, waving a hand like he was swatting away a fly, "because you were hovering around the upgrade list. Now, be a good girl. Head back to row 30 before I have to call someone." The cabin had gone quiet around them. Not silent exactly, but quiet in the way a room gets quiet right before something breaks, the soft jazz overhead suddenly too loud in the vacuum of everyone else's held breath. Delaney smoothed out the crease he'd put in her boarding pass, placed it back in the seat pocket, didn't move otherwise. Inside her skull, something old and familiar was starting to hum awake, a frequency she recognized, had spent years learning to modulate instead of suppress, because suppression never worked. Not really. It just built pressure somewhere else. "Be a good girl." She'd heard variations of that sentence her entire career. From instructors who didn't think women belonged in the pipeline. From a senior chief in her first unit who'd made a point of assigning her the worst logistics work for 8 straight months to see if she'd quit. From exactly one man in a cave in the dark who had looked at her with something between rage and disbelief in the half-second before she put 2 rounds through his chest, because, apparently, even dying men held on to their assumptions until the very last moment. Be a good girl. She was 28 years old, and she had held a dying friend's femoral artery closed with her bare hand while crawling backward through rubble, and this man in his $6,000 suit thought the word sweetheart was going to move her. "I suggest," she said, voice dropping half an octave, hardening at the edges just enough to register as a warning to anyone with the instincts to hear it. "You find your assigned seat, sir." His face went a shade of red that clashed badly with his tie. He slammed a hand against the overhead bin. The sound cracked through the cabin. A woman in row 4 jumped hard enough to spill her water. Stewardess. Roberta Voss had been working first class for 11 years. And in 11 years, she had developed a very particular sixth sense for exactly how bad a situation was about to get, based on nothing more than the tone of a single shouted word. This one was bad. She moved down the aisle fast, smile already fixed into place, the professional mask she could put on and take off like a coat, though underneath it, her stomach was already sinking, because she recognized the man doing the shouting. Mr. Kingsley, warm, practiced, the name coming out smooth from 1,000 repetitions on 1,000 identical flights. "Is there a problem?" "There is a massive problem, Roberta." He gestured wildly at the woman in the window seat, the young one, blonde hair, blue top, sitting there like none of this concerned her at all. "This person is in my seat, and she refuses to move. I want her removed now." Bobby turned, looked at the woman properly for the first time, young, late 20s maybe, athletic build under a top that read more casual than business. The kind of outfit that belonged to someone who didn't dress to impress anyone. Long blonde hair, no wedding ring, no visible signifiers of the kind of status that usually justified a seat like 3A in Bobby's admittedly imperfect internal calculus. And Bobby had 4 minutes until doors needed to close. 4 minutes, and a platinum member who flew this route every single week and tipped generously and had, on more than one occasion, complained loudly enough to cost a flight attendant her quarterly bonus. The math did itself before she could stop it. "Ma'am." Her voice shifted, sliding from professional into something thinner, sweeter, more patronizing than she'd have admitted out loud. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Delaney handed it over without a word. Second time in 3 minutes. She was starting to understand this particular flavor of bureaucratic theater, the kind where the same piece of paper had to be produced twice before anyone actually looked at it. Bobby studied it, frowned. "Well, mostly to herself. It does say 3A. She looked up, and here it came, the question that would replay in Bobby's own head at 3 in the morning for weeks afterward, the question she would give absolutely anything to unask. "Ma'am, are you a dependent? Is your husband, or your father perhaps, on the flight?" Sometimes the system splits reservations and upgrades the wrong party. Delaney went very still, because there it was. The specific shape of the question mattered more than its content. It wasn't really a question about logistics. It was a question about legitimacy, about whether a young woman, sitting quietly in a good seat, could possibly have earned it herself, or whether the more comfortable explanation, the one that required no adjustment to anybody's worldview, was that she'd arrived there through someone else's merit. "I'm not a dependent," Delaney said, each syllable landing with surgical precision. "I purchased the ticket." Kingsley groaned, loud, theatrical, checking a watch that cost more than Bobby made in 2 months. "Roberta, we're 10 minutes from pushback. I have a conference call the second we land. I need the workspace." This is ridiculous. She's obviously confused or lying. Just move her to coach so we can get in the air. Give her a voucher, free drink, whatever. And Bobby, God help her, felt the scale tip. Not because she believed him. Not really. Some small, honest part of her, buried under 11 years of institutional pressure and a very real fear of losing this job to a complaint from a man who clearly knew people, already suspected the truth. But belief and action had stopped being the same thing for Bobby Voss a long time ago. Somewhere around her third written warning for customer dissatisfaction that hadn't actually been her fault. "Ma'am." She stepped closer. Too close. Invading the specific pocket of space Delaney kept clear around her body without ever quite realizing she did it. "Look, we have a very full flight today. Obviously, there's been some sort of mix-up with the booking priorities. Mr. Kingsley is one of our most valued customers. I'm going to have to ask you to gather your things. I can find you a seat in the main cabin and we can sort out the refund difference at the desk after landing." Silence. Not from the cabin. From Delaney. A silence that stretched half a second, too long to be comfortable. The kind of silence that, if Bobby had spent 6 years training to read body language under stress the way Delaney had, might have told her something important was about to happen. No, Delaney said. Bobby blinked. Excuse me? No, flat, final, not louder than before, if anything quieter. I paid for this seat. I am sitting in this seat. If this gentleman has a grievance with the airline's booking algorithm, he can take it up with customer service after we land. But I am not moving. Kingsley laughed. A harsh, ugly sound, the kind that comes from a throat used to getting its way, and genuinely startled by the experience of not getting it. Oh, you're not moving. He stepped closer, close enough that Delaney could smell the scotch on his breath under the cologne. You think you can just hijack a seat because you feel entitled? Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea the kind of taxes I pay that probably fund whatever government handout bought you that ticket? And then his hand moved. Fast. Reflexive on his part, more than calculated, the gesture of a man used to solving problems by physically relocating whatever was in his way. He reached down toward the strap of her backpack, tucked near her feet. I'm not playing games with you, sweetheart. Get up, or I'm dragging you up. The moment his fingers touched the strap, the air in the cabin changed. Not a sound, a pressure shift. The kind of change a room undergoes right before violence, invisible to most people, unmistakable to anyone who has spent enough time standing on the wrong side of that particular threshold. Delaney moved. Subtle. A rotation of the torso, weight shifting off the hip, right hand rising, not to strike, never to strike first, but to intercept. The same motion, drilled into her body 10,000 times until it lived somewhere below conscious thought. She didn't touch him, didn't need to. Her posture alone did the talking, relaxed passenger collapsing into coiled spring in a fraction of a second that most of the watching cabin registered only as a vague sense that something had just gotten more dangerous. And underneath it, behind her eyes, in the half-second where her body acted faster than her mind could file a report on what it was doing, something else happened. The cabin smell, coffee and jet fuel and expensive cologne, gone. Replaced, for exactly one shattering heartbeat, by diesel smoke and dry heat, and the specific mineral taste of dust between her teeth, because that was how it worked. That was the thing nobody outside the community ever quite understood. That trauma didn't respect timelines, didn't care that this was a first-class cabin on a Tuesday morning, 11,000 years and 4 states away from a mountain pass she'd once bled in. A hand on her gear was a hand on her gear. Her nervous system did not distinguish between a rich man's grasping fingers and an enemy's. Not in that first half-second, not until the rest of her caught up and told the oldest, fastest part of her brain to stand down. Sand. Grit. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades, where there was only recycled cabin air. Shouting in a language that wasn't English, where there was only Kingsley's ragged breathing. The suffocating weight of armor she wasn't wearing. The faces of men who had once looked at her, not with condescension, but with the terrified absolute trust of people who needed her to be exactly as good as she'd trained to be, or they would die in the dark together. You held your ground, some old, buried part of her said, in a voice that wasn't quite her own anymore, hadn't been entirely her own since that night. You held your ground or you died. The flash lasted less than a second, long enough to sharpen everything. Long enough to strip the last soft edges off her focus until Garrett Kingsley's hand on her bag was the only object in the entire universe. Remove your hand, she said. Not loud. Not a request. A terminal instruction. He hesitated. Some animal part of him, buried under the suits and the platinum status and 30 years of never being told no, registered that something had shifted, that the woman in front of him was no longer performing calm. She simply was calm, in the specific, terrifying way of someone who had decided a great many things already, and none of them involved backing down. But his ego was too invested to retreat. Or what, he said, voice cracking slightly on the last syllable in a way he'd deny for the rest of his life. You're going to scratch me? Roberta, call the captain. Get security. I want this unruly passenger off my plane. She's threatening me. Bobby grabbed the interphone with hands that weren't quite steady. "Captain, we have a disturbance in first class. Passenger refusing to vacate a duplicate seat. Assignment. Becoming aggressive with a platinum member." Behind Bobby, in the rows further back, phones were already coming up, angled toward the aisle, the particular hunger for content that had become its own kind of American reflex. Whispers threading through the cabin. "Can you believe her? Just move, lady. It's not that deep." Delaney sat back, released the coiled tension in her shoulders 1 degree at a time, the way she'd trained herself to do, because staying wound too tight for too long burned energy she might need later, and eyes forward, she kept her focus locked on Kingsley, unwavering, unblinking, waiting. She knew what was coming. Had lived enough versions of institutional failure to know the shape of this one before it fully arrived. And underneath the calm, underneath the trained stillness, a small, exhausted, entirely human part of her thought, with something close to disbelief. "I hold a Silver Star citation in a drawer at home I've never even taken out of the envelope. And I still have to fight for a seat I already paid for." The cockpit door unlatched with a click that cut through the murmuring cabin like a gunshot. Captain Holt Fenwick emerged into first class, the way he'd emerged into 100 difficult rooms over 30 years of flying, moving with the unhurried authority of a man who had genuinely seen worse. Silver hair cropped close, a face carved from decades of sun and altitude, and the particular patience White required to commercial after a career that had, in an earlier chapter, involved considerably higher stakes than a delayed pushback. He adjusted his cap, scanned the scene in front of him with eyes that missed nothing. Not the red-faced man in the aisle, not the frazzled flight attendant with the interphone still gripped white-knuckled in one hand, not the blonde woman sitting with a stillness that struck him, immediately and for reasons he couldn't yet name, as unusual. What's going on here? Not a question, really. A demand delivered in a voice that had once talked a panicking co-pilot through an engine failure at 11,000 feet and had lost none of its command presence in the decades since. "Captain, thank God." Kingsley stepped forward, jabbing a finger toward Delaney like she was evidence in a trial only he understood. "This woman stole my seat. Roberta told her to move, she refused. Then she threatened me when I tried to help her move her bag. She's unstable. I want her off." Fenwick's gaze shifted to Bobby. "Is this true? She's refusing to cooperate." "Captain." Bobby's voice wavered, caught somewhere between the story she'd been telling herself for the last 5 minutes and the growing, uncomfortable sense that the story might not survive close inspection. "Mr. Kingsley is a platinum keyholder." "The manifest shows." Fenwick raised a hand, cut her off without a word. He turned toward Delaney, stepped closer, studied her the way he'd studied 1,000 ambiguous situations before making a call he couldn't take back, weighing posture, weighing tone, weighing the particular quality of stillness a person carried into a room like this. She was leaning forward slightly now, elbows on her knees, head bowed, not in submission, he registered, but in something closer to patience, a woman gathering the will to stay civil rather than a woman who lacked the will to fight. "Ma'am." Firm. Standard procedure, the opening line he'd used 100 times before on 100 lesser disputes. "On my aircraft we follow instructions. If the flight attendant asked you to." Delaney looked up. As she did, she rotated her shoulders back, squaring herself to address him fully, an unconscious habit that lived somewhere below thought, born of a decade of standing at attention in front of men whose opinion of her posture had once determined whether she got to keep her career. The movement pulled the strap of her royal blue top an inch to the side, and the morning sun, streaming low and gold through the still-open cabin door, caught the exposed skin near her right shoulder blade. Captain Fenwick's sentence died in his throat. His eyes had drifted, without his permission, from her face to her shoulder, and then locked, absolutely and completely, onto what the light had just revealed. It wasn't a butterfly, wasn't a flower, wasn't any of the soft, forgettable ink most people carried through airports without a second glance from strangers. An anchor, an eagle, wings spread taut with tension, even in stillness. A trident, lines precise, deliberate, The specific angle of a design that wasn't chosen from a wall of flash art in some tourist parlor, but drawn once by someone who understood exactly what it needed to mean. And below it, small, jagged, a string of characters that read to 99 passengers out of 100 on this flight as nothing more than decoration. To Holt Fenwick, they read as something else entirely, a unit designation. One that hadn't existed on any official organizational chart in years, not because it had been retired, but because certain things were never meant to be found on charts at all. Memorial ink, the kind you didn't buy on a whim, the kind you earned the hard way, usually on the worst night of your life, usually alongside the names of people who hadn't walked away from it. He froze. The air seemed to leave the cabin around him, replaced by a silence with a completely different texture than the tense, gossiping quiet from moments before. This silence had weight to it. Gravity. He looked at the tattoo, then back at her face, and this time he actually saw her. The way you see something only after you understand what you're looking at. The thin scar tracing along her hairline that concealer hadn't quite managed to hide. The particular stillness of her hands resting on her knees, relaxed but ready, the hands of someone whose body never fully forgot how to be armed, even when it wasn't. The calluses along her palms that had nothing to do with an office job. The eyes, distant for half a second, in a way that had nothing to do with the argument still hanging in the cabin air. 1,000-yard stare, carefully folded away behind decades of learned civility, but not gone. Never entirely gone. He knew that particular fold intimately, had practiced it himself for years after his own service, and recognizing it in a stranger felt like being handed a key to a door he hadn't opened in a long time. He knew what the tattoo meant, knew the unit. Knew, with a certainty that settled into his chest like something heavy and permanent, that women were not supposed to wear that particular ink, not unless they had earned it somewhere in the deep, unlit corners of a war the news never quite got around to covering. The cultural support teams, the handlers, the quiet professionals who walked into rooms men couldn't and did things the history books would sand smooth into something more comfortable. Decades from now, if they mentioned them at all. But there was more. A modification to the design that his memory, sharpened now, dragged up from somewhere far back. A small gold star, woven into the anchor with a precision that wasn't decorative. That detail changed everything. Meant something specific. Meant valor recognized at the highest level, or survival at a cost. Most people never had to imagine paying. Kingsley, watching all of this and understanding none of it, mistook the captain's stunned silence for agreement. "See," he said, a triumphant sneer spreading across his face. "Even the captain knows you're a fraud. Come on, let's go. Police are on their way." Fenwick's hand came up, sharp, commanding, absolute, quiet. His voice wasn't a rumble anymore. It cracked through the cabin like a whip, and Kingsley's mouth snapped shut so fast, his teeth clicked audibly. Fenwick turned back to Delaney, straightened his own shoulders, unconsciously mirroring the discipline he'd just witnessed in hers. "What's your name, ma'am?" Quiet, careful. A man asking a question he already suspected he knew part of the answer to and was afraid, in a way he hadn't been afraid in years, of getting it wrong. "Delaney Ashworth," she said. Fenwick's jaw tightened, because he knew that name. Not the way a stranger knows a name from a newspaper. The way a man knows a name that has traveled quietly through a very specific community for a very specific reason. Whispered in briefing rooms and hospital hallways, and the kind of ceremonies that rarely made it onto television. Ashworth. The extraction. The vent shaft. The name attached to a Silver Star citation that had, according to rumors he'd only half believed until this exact second, been quietly upgraded in review to something considerably higher. He didn't say any of that out loud. Not yet. There would be time for that, and it would come faster than either of them expected, in the form of 2 black SUVs already, at this very moment, receiving urgent clearance to cross a runway that civilian vehicles were never supposed to touch. For now, Captain Holt Fenwick simply turned to Bobby Voss, held out his hand, and said, in a voice gone quiet and dangerous in a completely different register than before, "Give me the manifest." Bobby's fingers trembled slightly as she handed over the tablet. "But Captain," she started. "Mr. Kingsley is. I know exactly who Mr. Kingsley is," Fenwick said, without looking up from the screen, scrolling past a flashing VIP tag with a level of contempt that made Bobby physically flinch. "I'm starting to understand who he's been treating like nobody." He found the entry. 3A. Ashworth. Delaney. No VIP tag. No frequent flyer status. No miles logged that would explain, in the ordinary civilian logic of the airline's booking algorithm, why this particular seat belonged to this particular passenger. Just a code. Government rate. Priority tier, the kind of designation that existed several layers beneath the ordinary commercial system. Most passengers never had reason to know existed at all. Fenwick tapped it, read the expanded text, and felt for the second time in under 2 minutes, every ounce of blood drained slowly out of his face. Kingsley, oblivious, checked his watch again, sighed loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Can we please move this along?" he said. "Some of us actually have somewhere important to be today." Fenwick looked up from the tablet, looked at Kingsley the way a man looks at something he's just realized has been standing far too close to a live wire without any idea of the danger. "You want her off this flight," he said. Slow, deliberate, each word its own small detonation. "Her. She's a nuisance," Kingsley said, oblivious, still riding the fading high of imagined vindication. Probably some enlisted spouse trying to feel important for a day. Something in Fenwick's face went very still. He reached for his radio, unclipped it from his belt with the unhurried precision of a man who had made exactly this kind of call before, in circumstances that had nothing to do with airplanes at all. Keyed the mic. "Tower, this is Flight 492, at Gate Charlie 4. We have a security situation. I need airport police at the aircraft door, and I need someone to reach the base liaison officer at the nearest naval installation. Immediately." Kingsley's smirk finally faltered, just slightly, uncertainty creeping in around the edges for the first time since he'd first opened his mouth in that aisle. Finally, he said, though the confidence in his voice had thinned considerably, "Get her out of here." "I'm not calling them for her," Fenwick said, turning to look Kingsley directly in the eye, voice dropping into something colder than anything the cabin had heard from him yet. "I'm calling them for you." The next several minutes, unspooled for the rest of the cabin, as a kind of confused, half-witnessed blur, the ordinary machinery of a delayed flight overlaid suddenly with something that felt entirely different in its texture, urgent in a way that had nothing to do with departure schedules. Through the windows on the left side of the aircraft, passengers began to notice movement on the tarmac that had no business happening at a civilian gate. Flashing lights that weren't the usual airport security cart, 2 black SUVs moving with a speed and directness that suggested whoever was driving them had never once in their lives worried about a parking violation, pulling up directly alongside the jet bridge. A breach of protocol, though none of the passengers watching had the frame of reference to know that. The kind of arrival that, on any ordinary day, was reserved for heads of state, or for the rare, highest priority military emergency that superseded the entire civilian ground operation without so much as a phone call of apology. Kingsley, still standing in the aisle, hadn't fully processed the shift in the room's atmosphere. Some stubborn, unkillable part of his certainty was still narrating a different version of events, one where the cavalry currently arriving on the tarmac had been summoned specifically to remove the blonde woman in the window seat, and where he would land in Washington in time for his call, having successfully defended the sanctity of first class from an interloper. He was, in fact, already composing the complaint email in his head. Subject line drafted. Opening sentence half formed. Something about unprofessional conduct and hostile environments and the general erosion of standards in modern air travel. The cabin door swung open. It wasn't TSA. Wasn't local police, though a pair of them would arrive moments later, hanging back near the jet bridge with an unmistakable air of men who had been told, in no uncertain terms, that this situation belonged to somebody considerably above their pay grade. The first person through the door was a woman in a sharp charcoal suit who radiated a kind of quiet authority that made the businessman in 3B instinctively lower his phone. Behind her, two military police officers in crisp uniforms, and behind them, moving with the unmistakable weight of rank, a man in Navy service khakis, ribbons stacked across his chest in rows that told a story longer than most people's entire careers. Rear Admiral Thomas Whitfield. Though Delaney, sitting very still in seat 3A with her hands folded in her lap, already knew exactly who had just walked onto her flight. Had known, in fact, the moment Fenwick's face had changed, that whatever came next would not be small. The Admiral's eyes swept the cabin once. Found what he was looking for immediately. "Where is she?" he said, voice carrying, filling the entire first-class section without any apparent effort. Fenwick stepped aside, gestured toward 3A without a word. The Admiral moved down the narrow aisle with a purposeful, unhurried stride, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who had never once in his career needed to rush to be taken seriously. Kingsley, still not understanding, still riding the last fumes of his own certainty, stepped directly into his path. "Admiral," he said, extending a hand, a smile already forming that he clearly intended to be charming. "Thank you for coming. This woman has been causing an incredible amount of..." The Admiral didn't look at him, didn't so much as slow his stride. His shoulder caught Kingsley's outstretched arm, with enough force to send the man stumbling backward into the empty seat beside Delaney's, his tumbler of scotch tipping, spilling a dark stain across the pristine carpet that nobody in that cabin, for the rest of the flight, would think to worry about cleaning. The Admiral stopped directly in front of Delaney. The entire cabin, without anyone quite deciding to, held its breath at once. Delaney rose slowly to her feet, smoothed the front of her blue top with one hand, a small, almost unconscious gesture, the kind of thing a person does to buy themselves half a second of composure before a moment that matters. She looked at the Admiral, and for the first time since she'd boarded this aircraft, since long before that, if anyone had been paying close enough attention to notice, something in her face softened, just slightly, into something that might have been called, in a woman who allowed herself such things more often, relief. "Hello, sir," she said. The Admiral snapped a salute, crisp, precise, cutting through the recycled cabin air with a formality that felt almost violent in its correctness, the kind of salute a person only ever sees performed with complete sincerity a handful of times in an entire lifetime, if they're lucky, or unlucky, enough to be present for it. He held it long enough that even the passengers who understood nothing of military protocol understood on some instinctive level that this was not an ordinary gesture between strangers. This was not a superior officer offering rote courtesy to a subordinate. This was something else, something closer, in its weight and its stillness, to reverence. Delaney returned the salute. Only then did the Admiral lower his hand. "Chief Ashworth," he said, and the word landed in that cabin with a gravity that seemed to physically press the air down around it. "I was told there was an issue with your transport." "Just a misunderstanding, Admiral." Her voice stayed soft, controlled, though something underneath it had loosened, some tightly wound coil finally allowed to unspool half a turn. "This gentleman thought I was in the wrong seat." The Admiral turned, slowly, faced Garrett Kingsley directly for the first time, and the look on his face was the specific controlled contempt of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to make his disapproval felt without ever raising his voice. "A misunderstanding," the Admiral repeated. He let the word sit there, let it curdle in the silence. "You tried to have Chief Petty Officer Delaney Ashworth removed from her seat." Kingsley, still tangled half upright in the empty chair he'd stumbled into, opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't know," he stammered. "She didn't look. I mean, she's a woman, and she's a woman," the Admiral cut in, voice like grinding stone, "who is the first woman in the history of this country's special operations community to complete the full pipeline and operate at the highest tier of it. She has been wounded in combat on multiple occasions. 2 years ago, she went into a collapsed cave system alone, under fire, to pull a fellow operator out of a position everyone else believed was unreachable, and she carried him 300 meters on her back, with active shrapnel wounds of her own, which is where she got the scarring across her shoulder blade that you were apparently so quick to judge, without ever bothering to ask. The cabin had gone completely, utterly silent. "She is flying to Washington," the Admiral continued, "to have the President of the United States place a medal around her neck that most people only ever see in films. And you." He let the pause stretch, cruel in its patience. "You wanted her moved to coach, so you'd have more room for your laptop." Kingsley made a sound that wasn't quite words. "I'm sorry," he finally managed, the volume gone entirely out of him now, reduced to something small and cracked. "I didn't know." "Ignorance," Captain Fenwick said from the cockpit doorway, arms crossed, voice carrying its own particular verdict, "is not an excuse for disrespect." He turned his attention to Bobby Voss, who stood frozen near the galley, with the interphone still clutched uselessly in one hand. "And you," Fenwick said, "your job is to protect the safety and dignity of every passenger on this aircraft, not to profile them based on which one looked more inconvenient to upset." Bobby's chin trembled. "I followed the protocol for conflict resolution, Captain." "You followed the protocol for appeasing whoever shouted loudest," Fenwick said, not unkindly exactly, but without mercy either. "There's a difference. It's about to become the most important lesson of your career, if you let it." The Admiral turned back to Delaney. "Chief, we can arrange private transport if you'd prefer. You don't have to fly out with these civilians." Delaney glanced past him. At Kingsley, shrinking now into the very seat he had, minutes earlier, insisted was rightfully his. At Bobby, standing on the edge of tears, the professional mask she'd worn for 11 years finally, completely cracked. At the rest of the cabin, faces turned toward her carrying a strange, uneven mixture of awe and shame. "No, sir," she said. "I'm fine here. I'd just like to get home." She paused, looked, one more time, at the man who had called her sweetheart 40 minutes ago, like it was a weapon. "I think this gentleman was just leaving, though." The Admiral nodded to the 2 military police officers waiting near the cabin door. "Escort Mr. Kingsley off the aircraft. He can discuss his conduct with the Federal Air Marshal's office regarding interference with a flight crew aboard a protected transport." "Now wait just a—" Kingsley started. "Now," the Admiral said, and the single word landed with enough force that Kingsley's protest died somewhere in his throat. He gathered his bag, with hands that had gone visibly unsteady, his face burning with a humiliation that ran deeper than anything he had likely ever inflicted on a waiter, a clerk, or anyone else who had spent a career absorbing men like him with a practiced, professional smile. As he was walked back down the aisle toward the open cabin door, past rows of passengers who had, minutes earlier, been filming the confrontation with a certain hungry glee, past faces that now watched his exit in a silence that felt, to him, considerably louder than any shouting could have been. Someone near row 10 began to clap. Then another. Then gradually, unmistakably, the entire cabin, not for the spectacle, not for the fall of a man who deserved every ounce of his own unraveling, but for the woman who had simply, quietly, refused to move. Delaney didn't turn to watch him go. Didn't need to. She sat very still, in the seat that had always, from the very beginning, belonged to her. The Admiral shook her hand one final time, before he stepped back off the aircraft, his own men falling in, behind him. "See you in D.C., Chief," he said. The cabin door closed, a few moments later, sealing the aircraft back into its ordinary hum, and Captain Fenwick's voice came over the intercom, steadier now, though something in its tone still carried the residue of what had just happened. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Apologies for the delay. We had some cargo that needed to be offloaded." A small, appreciative murmur ran through the cabin at that. "We'll get you into D.C. as quickly as we can." And to the passenger in 3 Alpha. A pause, deliberate, the words chosen with obvious care. "It's an honor to have you aboard. Drinks are on the house today for the entire first-class cabin, except, apparently, for the empty seat in 3 Bravo." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the rows. Delaney sat back, didn't gloat, didn't reach for her phone, Simply opened her book again, the same worn paperback she'd barely gotten a single paragraph into before all of this began, and let the plane taxi forward beneath her. As the wheels rolled over a seam in the tarmac, a small vibration traveling up through the floor and into her spine, something in the back of her mind loosened, just slightly, the way it sometimes did in the quiet after adrenaline finally had nowhere left to go. The flash again. Brief, uninvited, the vent shaft, the dark. Cole's voice ragged, somewhere behind her, in the collapsing dark, telling her to go, to leave him, to not be an idiot about this. She hadn't listened then, either. Outside the window, the terminal slid away, replaced by open runway, then by sky, gray and vast and indifferent, exactly the way it had looked from 100 other departures in 100 other lives she'd lived inside this one. Bobby Voss appeared at her elbow a few minutes later, holding a glass of champagne with a hand that hadn't quite stopped shaking. "Miss Chief," she corrected herself quickly. "I am so incredibly sorry. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. I was tired, and I let him push me, and it won't happen again." Delaney looked up at her, saw underneath the polished uniform and the practiced smile now fully dismantled, a woman who had simply made a mistake under pressure, the way people did, the way institutions quietly trained them to, one small compromise at a time, until the compromises added up to something with real weight. She took the champagne. Didn't smile exactly, but something in her eyes eased just slightly. "Standards matter," Delaney said quietly. "Doesn't matter who the person is, or what they're wearing. The rules apply to everyone. Don't let the loud ones drown out the right ones." "I won't," Bobby whispered. "Thank you." Delaney turned back toward the window, watched the ground fall away beneath the aircraft, California unspooling into brown hills, and then into cloud. The entire coastline she'd called home for the better part of a decade, shrinking into something small enough to hold in one hand. She touched briefly, without meaning to, the spot on her shoulder where the ink lived beneath the fabric. She hadn't asked for any of what had just happened in that cabin. Hadn't wanted the applause. Hadn't wanted the Admiral's dramatic entrance. Hadn't wanted any part of the spectacle that had briefly turned her into the main event of 40 strangers Tuesday morning. What she wanted, sitting there with the champagne going flat and untouched in her hand, was considerably simpler and considerably harder to explain to anyone who hadn't spent a decade learning exactly how much it cost to earn the right to be believed. She wanted, more than anything, to close her eyes for a few hours and not dream about the dark. The flight continued east. Somewhere over Nevada, she finally let herself drift, the paperback open and forgotten across her lap, her mind sliding, despite every trained instinct telling it not to, back toward a night 2 years earlier that had never fully let go of her and never entirely would. That was where the real story began. Not in first class. Not with Garrett Kingsley's tumbler of scotch, or Bobby Voss's misplaced sympathy, or even the Admiral's crisp, unforgettable salute. It began underground, in the dark, with a friend bleeding out 30 meters away, and a gap in the rock barely wide enough for her body to fit through, and a decision that had taken her less than a second to make and would take the rest of her life to fully carry. Part 2. Nevada gave way to nothing but sky. Delaney's eyes had drifted shut somewhere over the border, the paperback slipping half off her lap, one hand still loosely holding the spine like she might need it again in a hurry. She hadn't meant to sleep. She never meant to. Sleep on command was a thing other people did. Ordinary people, the kind who trusted their own minds enough to let go of the wheel for a while. She wasn't that kind of person anymore. Hadn't been for 2 years. Which was, of course, exactly when the dark found her. Not slowly. Never slowly. That was the cruel design of it, the way the mind didn't ease you into memory, the way movies like to pretend. Soft fade, gentle music swelling underneath. No. It slammed the door behind you first, locked it, and only then did it turn on the lights. Northern reach of a mountain range that didn't officially exist on any map the public had access to. 2:14 in the morning. Local time, though time meant almost nothing down there, in that particular black. Delaney remembered the cold first. Always the cold first. Rock holds cold like a grudge, releases it slow, patient, indifferent to whatever's crawling through it. Her team had gone in 8 strong. 8, which was the number that mattered most in the whole story, though nobody who read about it later, nobody who saw the ribbon or the citation or the careful, sanitized paragraph in her personnel file would ever fully understand why. Because 8 went in, and it should have stayed 8. Should have been routine. A perimeter breach, a target confirmation, an extraction inside 40 minutes, the kind of operation her team had run a dozen times without incident, except somebody on the other side had been waiting, which changed everything. The first round came from an angle nobody had cleared, which was the whole horror of it, really, not the violence itself but the specific, sickening realization that violence was arriving from a direction the plan hadn't accounted for. Muzzle flash lighting the dark in short, ugly bursts. Voices screaming in a language that wasn't hers, over the radio, under it, everywhere at once. And then Boone went down. Cole Boone, tank. The biggest man on the team, the loudest, the one who made even the worst missions bearable with a joke delivered at exactly the wrong moment. Hit hard in the upper thigh by something that tore straight through muscle and artery and left him on the ground in under 2 seconds, a sound coming out of him that Delaney had never heard a human being make before and had spent 2 years trying, without success, to forget. She was moving before her mind finished processing what her ears had told it. That was the thing about training. Real training. Not the kind you saw in movies, heroic slow-motion triumphant music. Real training stripped the thinking out of the moment entirely, left behind only reflex, until a body could act with more intelligence than the mind riding inside it had time to summon. She was on the ground next to him in 4 seconds. Hands on the wound before conscious thought caught up. Pressure. Direct pressure. Both palms, her entire weight behind it, because a femoral bleed didn't wait for anyone's permission to become fatal. Didn't care how brave you'd been 5 minutes earlier. Didn't care about rank or reputation, or the fact that Cole Boone had once talked 3 separate commanding officers out of a court-martial with nothing but charm and audacity. "Stay with me," she said. Or thought she said. Later she was never entirely sure which words had made it out of her mouth, and which had simply screamed inside her skull. "Cole, look at me. Stay with me, kinda." His voice cracked wet, wrong. "Kinda busy dying over here, Chief. Not on my watch, gunfire, closer now." And the extraction point, the one they'd planned for, the one drawn in careful lines on a map, back at base, that had made everything look so orderly, so manageable, was on the wrong side of a rockfall that had collapsed sometime in the last 6 hours, sealed the only clean route in or out, which left the vent shaft, which nobody had wanted to talk about in the briefing, which their team lead, a grizzled master chief with 22 years in and a face like weathered granite, had flagged as an absolute last resort, the kind of option you didn't plan around, because planning around it meant admitting the mission might go wrong enough to need it. It had gone wrong enough to need it. The shaft was 18 inches wide at its narrowest point, maybe 20. Delaney had measured it herself, once, with her own shoulders, back at the staging area, a precaution nobody expected to ever actually matter, filed away the way she filed everything quietly, without ceremony, because that was simply what she did. She was the only one small enough to fit. She remembered the Master Chief's face when the math became unavoidable. Remembered the way he'd looked at her, not with doubt exactly, but with the specific dread of a commander who understood, in the space of half a second, that he was about to send the smallest person on his team into total darkness alone, toward an enemy position nobody had eyes on, while the rest of them held a collapsing perimeter and hoped. Ashworth, his voice, rough, urgent. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she'd said. "There's nobody else who fits." And that had been the entire conversation. No speeches, no dramatic vow, just a fact stated plainly, because the moment hadn't left room for anything softer than that. Inside the shaft there was no light at all. None. Which was a specific kind of dark most people never experienced in an entire lifetime. The true absence of it, Not the dark of a bedroom at night, with a hallway light bleeding under the door. Not the dark of a power outage, with a phone screen glowing somewhere nearby. Absolute total. The kind of dark that made her own hands, held 6 inches from her face, disappear completely. She crawled forward on elbows and knees, rifle slung tight against her back, because there wasn't room to carry it any other way, stone scraping across her shoulders, hard enough to tear through fabric, then skin, though she wouldn't feel the second part until much later. Adrenaline doing what adrenaline did, holding pain at arm's length until the body decided it was safe enough to let it back in. 12 feet, which doesn't sound like much, which is nothing, really, on paper, a distance you'd cross in a grocery store aisle without a second thought, except every foot of it required her to exhale completely, flatten her ribs against the effort, and pull herself forward through a gap that seemed, twice, to genuinely refuse to let her body pass at all. Because that was the part nobody understood from the outside. The part that never made it into any citation, any medal ceremony, any polite paragraph, read aloud by a colonel in dress uniform. The part where, at roughly the 7-foot mark, wedged between 2 immovable slabs of rock, with her lungs screaming and her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth, Delaney Ashworth had genuinely, completely believed she was going to die there. Stuck alone. In the absolute dark, 30 meters from a man who needed her, unable to move forward or backward, her own body having become the exact thing standing between her and the only outcome that mattered. She didn't scream. Screaming used air she didn't have to spare. Instead, she did the only thing training had left her, which was breathe out, all the way out, past the point that felt survivable, until her ribs collapsed just enough, just barely enough, to slide another 6 inches forward through the gap. Which worked. Barely. Until it worked again and again. Until, after what felt like an hour and had actually been closer to 90 seconds, the rock opened into a wider chamber, and she dropped hard onto packed earth on the other side, gasping, bleeding from a dozen small tears across her shoulders and back that she genuinely hadn't registered yet. 3 men stood in that chamber, backs to her, weapons trained on a corridor she couldn't see. She had 4 rounds of surprise on her side and nothing else. Her silenced pistol coughed 3 times. Fast, clean. The specific, terrible efficiency of 6 years of training, arriving all at once in under 2 seconds, and then it was over, and the chamber was quiet except for her own ragged breathing and a ringing silence that felt, in the moment, louder than any gunfire could have been. She didn't look at what she'd done. Not then. Later, in the sterile quiet of a debrief room, and later, still, in the much less sterile quiet of 3A. 18 months on, she would look at it plenty, but not then. Then, there was only Cole, 30 meters further in, bleeding out on packed dirt with a tourniquet she'd have to improvise from her own belt. She found him in the dark by the sound of his breathing. Shallow, too shallow. Cole Chief. His voice, barely audible now, had lost the earlier edge of pain, replaced by something worse, a kind of dreamy distance that she recognized instantly as the specific, terrifying calm of a body starting to shut itself down. You made it. Knew you would. Don't talk. Save it. Gonna talk anyway. A wet, weak laugh. Kinda my whole thing. She got the tourniquet on. Tight. Too tight, probably, but too tight was better than the alternative, and there was no time to calibrate for comfort 30 meters, underground, with an enemy position, somewhere beyond the chamber that might not be as cleared as she needed it to be. Then came the part that never made it into any official record at all. 300 meters. That was the distance from the chamber to the extraction point, the one that had originally been the backup plan and was now, thanks to the rockfall, the only plan left. 300 meters of uneven ground, in the dark, under intermittent fire, dragging a man who outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds, her own back torn open and bleeding freely now that the adrenaline had started. In places, to fray. She didn't remember most of it clearly. That was the strange mercy of trauma, the way it sometimes blurred, the worst stretches into something almost merciful in its incompleteness. She remembered fragments, the specific, unbearable weight of him across her shoulders. A moment where her legs simply refused to hold either of them anymore, and she went down hard onto one knee. And the sound that came out of her throat in that instant wasn't quite a word, wasn't quite a sob, was something older and more animal than either. She remembered getting back up anyway, because there wasn't a version of this where she didn't. She remembered the rotors before she remembered anything else. The specific, unmistakable thump of a helicopter close overhead, cutting through the ringing in her ears, like the first sound in the world that meant something other than danger. She remembered a voice through the radio, calm, in a way that felt almost impossible given the circumstances, guiding her the last 100 meters toward a landing zone she could barely see. She never saw the pilot's face that night, not once. Never had a reason to wonder about it. In fact, in all the months and years since, because the mission debrief listed only call signs, and the specific human being flying that aircraft through hostile airspace to pull 2 bleeding operators off a mountainside in the dark had simply never crossed her mind as a person she might one day meet again, seated a few feet away from her, wearing a captain's uniform, on a commercial flight to Washington. She woke with a gasp, small, contained. The kind of sound she'd trained herself, over 2 years of therapy and considerably more nights than she'd ever admit to anyone, to keep quiet enough that it wouldn't wake whoever happened to be sleeping beside her, though there was nobody beside her now, just a stranger, 2 seats over, absorbed in a crossword and a flight attendant's cart rattling somewhere up the aisle. Her hand had found her own shoulder before she was fully conscious. Pressed flat against the fabric of her top, over the tattoo, the scar tissue beneath it that no amount of laser treatment had ever quite smoothed away, because that was where the shrapnel had caught her, somewhere in that 300 meters, though she genuinely couldn't say when, some fragment of something explosive enough to leave a permanent constellation of small, pale scars across her upper back had found her without her even noticing at the time, too consumed by the far more urgent problem of Cole's weight and Cole's breathing, and the distance still left to cross. She hadn't felt it happen, which somehow made it worse in the years since. The idea that her body had been wounded and she simply hadn't had room, in that moment, to register the fact. "You all right?" The voice came from her left, not sharp, careful, in a way that suggested whoever was asking had some experience with exactly what kind of waking she'd just done. She turned. Captain Fenwick stood in the aisle beside her seat, not in uniform anymore, jacket off, sleeves rolled, a coffee in each hand, like he'd walked back specifically to offer her one. "Fine," she said. Automatic. The word that came out before any of the more honest ones had a chance to. He didn't push. Just held one of the coffees out toward her, and something in the gesture, unhurried, undemanding, made her take it. "Cabin's quiet," he said. "First officers got things handled up front. Figured I'd stretch my legs. Is that allowed?" "I'm the captain." A faint, tired smile. "I get to make that call." He didn't sit exactly, but he leaned against the empty seat across the aisle, the one that had briefly, disastrously, belonged to Garrett Kingsley, in a posture that suggested he wasn't in any hurry to leave. "You were somewhere else just now," he said. Quiet. Not quite a question. Delaney looked at the coffee in her hands, instead of at him. "Sometimes happens. I know." Something in the way he said those 2 words made her look up, because there was a specific way people said "I know" when they meant nothing at all by it, a filler phrase, empathy performed rather than felt, and there was a completely different way people said it when the words carried actual weight behind them, when the person saying it had somewhere, at some point, stood on the exact same ground. This was the second kind. "You were in the service," she said. "Not a question either. 22 years. Navy before I flew commercial." He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Medevac, mostly. Some other things earlier on that I don't talk about at dinner parties." Something small and cold moved through Delaney's chest. A pattern match her mind was making faster than her conscious thought could keep up with, though she didn't have the words for it yet. Medevac, where, all over. Wherever they needed a bird, and a crazy enough pilot to fly it in a weather nobody sane would fly in. He said it lightly, but something underneath the lightness didn't match. Retired 7 years ago. Started flying for the airline because I genuinely didn't know how to be a person who didn't fly. She nodded slowly. Filed it away, the way she filed everything. A fact about a stranger who'd happened to be kind to her at exactly the right moment. Except something about the timing wouldn't quite settle. 2 years ago, she said, carefully, testing the water of a thought she wasn't sure she wanted to finish having. Were you still flying then? Medevac. Fenwick went very still. Just for a second. Just long enough that, if she hadn't spent 6 years learning to read the smallest shifts in another person's body language for a living, she might have missed it entirely. Where? He said. Voice careful now. Deliberate. Where exactly are we talking about? Northern Reach, she said. A mountain range I'm not supposed to name to strangers on airplanes. His jaw tightened. The coffee cup in his hand trembled. Just slightly. Just enough to send a small ripple across the surface. February, he said. Not a question at all now. A statement arriving from somewhere deep, somewhere he clearly hadn't expected to visit again today. Just past 2 in the morning. Delaney's heart had gone somewhere strange in her chest, somewhere between her throat and her stomach, a sensation she associated usually with the half-second before something in a mission went either very right or very wrong. 2 operators, Fenwick continued, slowly, like each word cost him something to produce. Called it in as a hard extract. Hostile terrain, no clean LZ. I remember thinking, this whole flight home, that whoever the smaller one was, the one half carrying the bigger guy across that last stretch of open ground, I remember thinking that person shouldn't have been physically capable of what I was watching them do. Delaney's hands had gone still around her coffee. I never saw your face, she said quiet. Never even thought to wonder about it. You were just a voice on the radio. And rotors. I never saw yours either. He looked at her now, fully. Something in his expression that hadn't been there a moment ago. Something raw underneath 30 years of practiced composure. Just 2 shapes on a thermal camera. One dragging the other across ground that should have taken them both down twice over. Silence sat between them. Not empty. Never empty. Not with these 2 people. Not with what they were both, in this exact moment, quietly realizing they'd unknowingly shared. I flew that whole route home in a kind of daze, Fenwick admitted. Kept thinking about it for weeks after. Wondering if you both made it. Never had a way to find out. That's the cruelty of it. The way you fly these people out of the worst night of their lives, and then you never learn what happened to them after. You just have to trust it worked out. Most nights, you don't get that gift. He made it, Delaney said. Cole. He's walking again. Slower than he wants. Faster than the doctors expected. Something shifted across Fenwick's face, an easing, a weight visibly lifting, that had apparently been sitting there for 2 years without her ever knowing it existed. Good, he said. Just that. The word carrying more than its size should have allowed. You're the reason we're both alive, Delaney said. I never got the chance to say that to whoever was flying. Never even occurred to me it might be someone I'd meet again like this. Small world, Fenwick said. Quiet. A little unsteady. Smaller than it has any right to be. Or the universe has a strange sense of humor. A real smile finally broke across his face. Brief but genuine. 22 years in the Navy, I stopped believing in coincidence a long time ago, Chief. I believe in patterns I don't always understand. This feels like one of them. He straightened, coffee cup still in hand, and for a moment neither of them said anything else. The silence between them entirely different now than it had been a minute earlier. No longer strangers occupying adjacent space, but 2 people who had, without either of them realizing it, already shared the worst night either had lived through. I should get back up front, he said finally. Captain. He paused. Turned back. Thank you, she said. Simple. Direct. 2 words that had taken 2 years, and a chance encounter 35,000 feet over Nevada, to finally find their way to the person who'd earned them. Thank you for making it worth flying that route home, Fenwick said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, before he caught it, straightened his shoulders, and walked back toward the cockpit with the particular steadiness of a man determined not to let anyone see exactly how much that conversation had cost him. Somewhere behind the aircraft, several thousand miles closer to the ground, Garrett Kingsley sat in a small, windowless room off the main terminal at San Diego International, being asked a series of questions by a federal air marshal with a very patient, very unimpressed expression. His phone had been buzzing for the last 20 minutes. He'd been ignoring it, which was unusual for him, genuinely unusual, because Garrett Kingsley did not, as a rule, ignore his phone, not for federal agents, not for airline security, not for anyone, because ignoring his phone meant losing control of a narrative he was accustomed to controlling absolutely. But he wasn't ready, not yet, not for the particular voice waiting on the other end of that missed call. The marshal finished her notes, slid a clipboard across the small table toward him. "You're free to go, Mr. Kingsley, for now. The airline will follow up separately regarding your travel privileges going forward." He didn't answer, just stood, gathered his bag, and walked out into the terminal in a kind of fog he hadn't experienced since a long time ago. A different terminal, a different kind of humiliation, though the shape of it, standing here now, felt uncomfortably familiar. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "Dad." The voice on the other end belonged to his son, 26 years old. A voice Garrett hadn't heard sound quite this careful, this deliberately neutral in longer than he wanted to think about. "Tyler." He cleared his throat. "Everything all right?" "Saw a video," Tyler said. "Somebody posted it about 20 minutes ago. It's already got a few 100,000 views, Dad." "It's you." Garrett's stomach dropped somewhere near his shoes. "It's not what it." "I watched the whole thing." Tyler cut in, quiet, and something in his voice made the small windowless room, and the marshal, and the entire morning suddenly feel very far away and very small. "You called her sweetheart, told her to be a good girl, tried to grab her bag." Silence. "She's a chief, Dad. Special warfare. Silver Star at least, probably higher given how they scrambled a rear admiral to the gate." Garrett's throat had gone dry. "I didn't know who she was," he said, which was true, and which he understood, the second it left his mouth, was also the exact worst possible defense he could have offered. "You didn't need to know who she was," Tyler said, and now there was something else under the careful neutrality, something that sounded, unmistakably, like old, unhealed hurt finding a new place to land. "That was never the point, was it? You didn't think she deserved the seat because you looked at her and decided, in about 4 seconds, that she couldn't possibly have earned it." Garrett said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say to that, because some small, buried, deeply uncomfortable part of him understood exactly where this conversation was actually headed, understood it the way you understand a storm is coming before the first drop of rain ever falls. "You did the same thing to me," Tyler said, quiet now, quieter than Garrett had heard him in years. Different version. Same. "Math, I told you I didn't make it through the pipeline. Failed out in the 3rd week of selection. And you looked at me exactly the way you looked at her in that video. Like I'd stolen something. Like I didn't deserve to even be in the conversation." "Tyler, that's not." "I've got a meeting," Tyler said. Flat. Final. "I just wanted you to know I saw it, Dad. That's all." The line went dead. Garrett Kingsley stood alone in a crowded terminal, phone still pressed against his ear, long after the call had ended, the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday morning airport moving around him in a blur he couldn't quite bring himself to focus on, because there it was. The thing he'd spent 3 years refusing to look at directly, surfacing now, in the worst possible circumstances, in front of a room he'd never wanted to be seen in. His son had wanted to serve, had wanted it with a hunger Garrett had genuinely never understood, coming as it did from a kid who'd grown up with every advantage money could buy, private schools, summer homes, a path laid out so smoothly it required almost no effort at all to walk. Tyler could have taken over the family business, could have coasted comfortable into exactly the kind of life Garrett had spent 30 years building for precisely that purpose. Instead, at 22, he'd enlisted. Garrett remembered the conversation with a clarity that still, 3 years later, made something in his chest tighten unpleasantly. The disbelief. The barely concealed anger. What are you trying to prove? You have everything. Why would you throw it away to go crawl through mud with people who have nothing? Tyler had tried anyway, made it through boot camp, made it into the selection pipeline for the exact community. Garrett now understood with a sick, spreading horror that the woman on his flight this morning belonged to. Failed in week 3. A training injury, technically, though Garrett had never bothered to learn the specifics, had never asked, had simply absorbed the news with a kind of cold, silent disappointment that he'd told himself, at the time, was concern. It hadn't been concern. It had been exactly the same ugly instinct that had made him snatch a boarding pass out of a stranger's hand this morning and call her sweetheart like the word was a weapon. The instinct that measured a person's worth by whether their effort had produced a result he could brag about at dinner parties. The instinct that had no idea what to do with failure, with struggle, with anything that didn't arrive polished and finished and easy to display. He had spent 3 years quietly, coldly disappointed in his own son for trying and not succeeding at something most people never attempted at all. And this morning, without knowing it, without any of the context, he had aimed that exact same contempt at a woman who had not only succeeded, but had bled, underground, in the dark, to drag a friend back from the edge of death. Garrett Kingsley sat down on a bench near the terminal windows, phone still clutched loosely in one hand, and for the first time, in longer than he could comfortably remember, he did not know what to do with himself. Back on the aircraft, the hours settled into something quieter. Delaney dozed in intervals, the way she always did on flights, never fully under, always some small, wary part of her tracking the cabin around her, even with her eyes closed. Bobby Voss checked on her twice more, gentler each time, the earlier professional stiffness replaced by something that looked, increasingly, like genuine care rather than obligation. Around the 3-hour mark, Delaney's phone, which had switched to airplane mode hours earlier, but still buzzed faintly, with the Wi-Fi messages queuing behind the connection she'd activated, without quite remembering doing it, lit up with a name that made her sit up straighter. Cole, you're trending, Chief. Some genius filmed the whole thing. You're all over my feed. She stared at that for a long moment. Because of course someone had filmed it. Of course. In this exact era, in this exact country, there was no version of a public confrontation that didn't end up online within the hour, dissected by strangers who understood none of the context and all of the outrage. Please tell me it's not too embarrassing, she typed back. Embarrassing? Chief, you're a folk hero. There's already a hashtag. People are calling him boarding pass bro. Kill me now. Absolutely not. This is the best thing that's happened to my recovery in months. I've watched it 4 times. She laughed, quiet, the sound catching a curious glance from the crossword passenger 2 seats over. How's the leg holding up for tomorrow? Behaving itself. Mostly a fear of what I'll say about it publicly if it doesn't. You wouldn't. I absolutely would. I have a captive national audience now thanks to you, apparently. She smiled at the screen, warmth spreading slow through her chest, the specific comfort of an old friend's humor reaching across 3,000 miles to remind her, gently, that whatever chaos had unfolded in that cabin this morning, the people who mattered were still exactly where she'd left them. Her phone buzzed again. A different name this time. Mom. Sweetheart. Your Aunt Carol just sent me a video. Is that you? Why didn't you tell me you're famous now? Delaney closed her eyes, exhaled slowly. It's a long story, Mom. I'll explain when I land. Your father's already showing the neighbors. I tried to stop him. I did not succeed. Of course you didn't. We are so proud of you. We've always been proud of you. But today especially. That man should be ashamed of himself. Something tightened in Delaney's throat, unexpected, arriving from a much softer place than any of the tension the morning's confrontation had produced. Thanks, Mom. Love you. Love you more. Now go rest. You have a very big day tomorrow and your mother needs you well rested so she doesn't have to worry about 2 things at once. She set the phone down, looked out the window at the endless stretch of cloud beneath the aircraft. gold at the edges now as the sun climbed higher, and let herself finally feel something close to what the rest of the cabin had apparently been feeling since the moment the Admiral's SUVs pulled onto the tarmac. Pride not loud, not showy, just a quiet, settled warmth, the kind that came from knowing, with total certainty, that the people who mattered most had never once needed a viral video to understand exactly who she was. The descent into Washington began a little after 3 in the afternoon, the captain's voice coming over the intercom with the practiced calm of 1,000 identical announcements, though something in his tone, when he mentioned final approach, carried a warmth that hadn't been there on any of his previous updates. Delaney gathered her things slowly, duffel between her feet, paperback, still barely read, tucked back into her bag, the dress uniform, still safely garment-bagged, waiting in the overhead compartment for tomorrow's ceremony, for the moment that had, technically, been the entire point of this trip before an entitled stranger in a charcoal suit had turned it into something else entirely. Bobby Voss found her one last time as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. Chief Ashworth. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of the earlier performance entirely. I wanted to say again how sorry I am. And I wanted you to know. I requested additional training. Bias training specifically. I asked my supervisor this afternoon, actually, before we even landed. Delaney studied her for a moment. That took courage, she said, asking for that. Most people just wait for it to blow over. I don't want to be the kind of person who waits for things to blow over, Bobby said, and something in her voice suggested she meant it, all the way down. Then you're already better than you were this morning, Delaney said. That's not nothing. Bobby's eyes went a little glassy. Thank you. For not being cruel about it. You'd have had every right. Cruelty doesn't fix anything, Delaney said. I learned that the hard way, a long time ago, from people who could have been cruel to me, and chose something better instead. Seemed worth passing along. The aircraft door opened. Passengers began filing out, several of them offering small nods, quiet murmurs of thank you for your service, as they passed her seat, awkward and sincere in the particular way strangers often were when confronted, suddenly, with something larger than themselves. Delaney gathered her duffel, retrieved the garment bag from the overhead compartment, and stepped out into the aisle. Captain Finnick was waiting near the cockpit door. Chief, he said, extending a hand. She took it. Thank you, she said again, for everything. Tonight and 2 years ago. Give Colboon my regards, Fenwick said, something warm and rough in his voice. Tell him a stranger flying his ride home that night is glad he's walking again. I will. And Chief. He hesitated, just slightly, something clearly weighing on him that he hadn't quite decided how to say. For what it's worth, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever they pin on you. I've flown a lot of miles, seen a lot of people come and go through that cockpit door. Never once seen anyone earn it the way you did. She didn't trust herself to answer that with words, just nodded, squeezed his hand once, and walked up the jet bridge into the sprawling chaos of Washington Dulles. Duffel over one shoulder, dress uniform draped carefully over the other, the tattoo on her back hidden again beneath ordinary fabric, invisible to every stranger she passed, exactly the way she preferred it. Behind her, in a different terminal, 3,000 miles west, Garrett Kingsley sat alone, with a phone full of unanswered messages and a son's voice still echoing in his ears, beginning, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to understand exactly how much he had gotten wrong and exactly how little time he might have left to fix it. Ahead of her, in Washington, a hospital room waited with Colboon, practicing his walk down a hallway with careful, deliberate steps, counting down the hours until he could stand, on his own 2 feet, beside the woman who had once dragged him 300 meters through the dark rather than leave him behind. And somewhere in between the two of them, in the vast, indifferent machinery of a country that didn't always get it right the first time, but occasionally, when it mattered most, found its way to something close to justice. The story that had started in Seat 3A was only just beginning to reveal how far its roots actually ran. Part 3, Washington at dusk. Didn't look like a capital, not really. Looked like any other city catching its breath, taxis stacking up along the curb, cherry trees stripped bare for the season, wind cutting sideways off the Potomac with a chill that had nothing polite about it. Delaney checked into a hotel 2 blocks from the mall. Government rate, same as the ticket, the same quiet machinery that had moved her across the country, now moving her into a room with a view of absolutely nothing. An air shaft, a brick wall, the kind of room the Navy booked when it wanted you close, but didn't feel obligated to make close feel nice. She didn't mind. Never had. Hung the garment bag first. Careful. Zipper down slow, dress uniform exposed to the room's dry hotel air for the first time since San Diego, and she stood there a second longer than necessary just looking at it. Ribbons already sewn on. Rank insignia already placed. Someone at the base had done the work for her, because apparently that was a thing they did now. Apparently that was the level of ceremony her life had folded into overnight, which felt wrong somehow, because 6 years ago she'd have laughed at this. Would have said, out loud, to whoever was standing closest, that the whole thing was somebody else's story, somebody more deserving, somebody who hadn't spent 2 years waking up at 3 in the morning, with her own hand pressed flat against a scar she couldn't see. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, screen still lit with 40-some notifications she hadn't opened. Didn't open them now either. Instead she called her mother. There she is. Her mother's voice, warm instantly, the specific warmth that had been waiting on the other end of every phone call Delaney had ever made from anywhere dangerous, anywhere far, anywhere that wasn't home. Tell me you landed safe. Tell me nobody else tried to steal your seat. Landed safe, Mom, no more seat thieves. Your father wants to know what you're wearing tomorrow. Not the ceremony. After. For the pictures. I hadn't thought about pictures. Well, think about it. Aunt Carol's already planning a scrapbook page. Delaney laughed, the sound loosening something in her chest that had been wound tight since the moment Garrett Kingsley's voice first cut across that cabin. How's Dad? A pause. Small, the kind her mother always left before saying something that mattered more than the sentence around it. He cried again this morning, her mother said, watching that video for the 10th time. He keeps saying, "That's my daughter," like he still can't quite believe it's real. Something tightened behind Delaney's eyes. Tell him I said hi. Tell him yourself. He's standing right here pretending not to listen. A shuffle. Her father's voice, rougher around the edges but unmistakably soft underneath. Delaney. Hi, Dad, we're proud of you. Simple. Direct. The way he'd always been. A man who'd worked the same hardware store counter in the same small Ohio town for 31 years. And had never once needed more than 4 words to say what mattered most. Always have been. Always will be. I know, Dad. Get some sleep tonight. Big day. I will. She wouldn't. They both knew it. But some lies were kindnesses, spoken between people who loved each other enough to let them stand. Sleep, when it finally came, arrived thin and shallow, the kind that left her more tired on the other side of it than before she'd closed her eyes. By 6 the next morning she was awake for good, staring at the ceiling of a hotel room that wasn't hers, running the same 3 seconds of orientation she ran every morning of her life. Where am I? What year am I safe? The ceremony was scheduled for 11, which left 5 hours. 5 hours she hadn't planned for, hadn't built any particular ritual around, because the entire trip, until now, had been organized in her head around getting through the flight, getting to the hotel, getting to the ceremony. The gap in between had simply never occurred to her as something that would need filling. Her phone buzzed at 6:40. Not her mother. Not Cole. An unknown number, DC area code. She almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Except something in her, the same trained instinct that had once told her a jacket sat wrong on a stranger's shoulders in an airport security line, told her to answer instead. Ashworth. Silence on the other end. Not dead air. The specific silence of someone working up the nerve to speak. Chief Ashworth, a man's voice. Rough. Unsteady in a way that took her a second to place. And then, all at once, placed itself with a jolt that ran straight down her spine. Garrett Kingsley. I'm sorry to call this early, he said. I got your contact information through. It doesn't matter how. I know that's not the point. She didn't answer right away, because there were 100 things she could have said, because half of them would have been perfectly justified, sharp enough to end the call in 4 seconds flat, and some old, exhausted part of her genuinely considered doing exactly that. Except she didn't. How, she said instead. Flat, not warm, but not a slam door either. I flew out last night, Kingsley said. I'm at a hotel a few blocks from wherever you're staying. I don't know exactly where. I didn't come to ambush you, or to make some kind of scene. I promise you that. Then why did you come? A long pause. Because I need to say something to your face, he said. And because I don't think I have the right to say it over a phone. She looked out the window at the brick wall 6 feet from the glass, considered the 5 empty hours stretching ahead of her. Considered, too, the specific weight of the word sweetheart, the way it had landed in her chest yesterday morning, like something thrown, deliberate, designed to diminish. There's a coffee place 2 blocks from my hotel, she said finally. Corner of 9th and F. 8 o'clock. You've got 20 minutes, and then I'm done, and I don't want to hear from you again after that. That's more than fair, he said. Thank you. She hung up without saying goodbye, sat there a moment longer, phone in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. Because some part of her, the part that had spent 6 years learning to read intention in the smallest tremor of a stranger's voice, had heard something in Kingsley's this morning that hadn't been there yesterday. Not performance. Not damage control, dressed up as contrition. Something closer to actual fear. Which was, she realized, getting dressed in the gray morning light of a hotel room she'd never chosen and would never see again after today. The first honest thing that man had shown her since the moment he'd first stepped into that aisle. The coffee shop was nearly empty at 8. A handful of early commuters hunched over laptops, the smell of espresso thick enough to cut through the cold that had followed everyone in off the street. Kingsley was already there when she arrived. Sitting alone at a corner table, no charcoal suit today. Jeans. A plain jacket. Hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he clearly hadn't touched, because his hands, she noticed immediately, wouldn't have been steady enough to lift it without spilling. He stood when he saw her. Didn't extend a hand. Some remaining instinct, apparently, still knew better than that. Thank you for coming, he said. She sat across from him without responding. Waited. He sat back down slowly. I've spent the last day and a half, he started and then stopped. I've spent the last day and a half trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like an excuse. I don't think there is one. So I'm just going to say it badly and let you decide what to do with it. Go ahead. He looked down at the coffee, turned the cup a quarter turn, an unconscious gesture, buying himself half a second. I have a son, he said. Tyler. 26. Good kid. Better man than I've ever managed to be, if I'm honest. Which apparently I'm only capable of being when I've already burned everything else down first. Delaney said nothing. Let the silence do the work of pulling the rest out of him. 3 years ago he enlisted, Kingsley continued. Wanted the pipeline. The one you're a part of. I didn't understand it. Told him he had everything already. Told him he was throwing it away to go crawl through mud with people who had nothing to lose. Something in Delaney's chest went very still. He made it through basic, Kingsley said. Made it into selection. Failed in week 3. Training injury. I never even asked him the details. Just felt this cold, ugly disappointment settle into me, and I let him feel every ounce of it, because apparently that's who I am when someone I love doesn't succeed at something the way I expected them to. And yesterday, Delaney said quietly. And yesterday he called me, Kingsley said, voice cracking slightly on the words. After he saw the video. Told me I did to you exactly what I'd done to him 3 years earlier. Looked at someone. Decided, in about 4 seconds, they hadn't earned what they had. Never once considered asking what it actually cost them to get there. He looked up at her, then, eyes red-rimmed, genuinely, unmistakably wrecked in a way no amount of performance could fake. He was right, Kingsley said. About both things. I've spent 30 years measuring people by whether their effort produced something I could brag about at a dinner party. And when it didn't, when someone struggled, when someone failed, When someone simply didn't look the way I expected success to look, I decided they didn't deserve the space they were standing in. You called me sweetheart, Delaney said. Flat, not cruel, just true. Told me to be a good girl, I know. You tried to take my bag, I know. His voice broke fully on the second one. I've replayed it 100 times since yesterday morning. I keep seeing my own hand reaching for that strap and I don't even recognize the man attached to it. Silence stretched between them. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop at the corner. Doors opening, closing. The ordinary machinery of a city morning, continuing on without any awareness of the conversation happening 6 feet from the window. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Kingsley said finally. I know that's not something I get to ask for. I just needed you to know that I saw it, what I did, and who I did it to, and that it's already started changing something in me that I don't think I can put back the way it was. Delaney studied him for a long moment. Because she had every right, sitting in this small coffee shop on the morning of the biggest day of her career, to simply stand up and walk out. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody would have called it anything but justified, except she thought about the vent shaft. Thought about the specific, suffocating terror of being wedged in rock, certain for one unbearable stretch of seconds that she would die there. Thought about how close she'd come to a version of herself that stopped trying, that gave up 8 inches from freedom, because the fear had simply gotten too large to argue with. She hadn't stopped, because somebody once, a long time ago, in a different context entirely, had told her that the hardest part of surviving anything wasn't the moment of crisis. It was what you did with yourself afterward. Whether you let the worst thing you'd ever done, or the worst thing that had ever happened to you, become the entire shape of who you were going forward. You have a chance most people never get, she said finally. The chance to actually see it. Most people go their whole lives doing exactly what you did yesterday and never once get shown the mirror. I know. Don't waste it feeling sorry for yourself, she said. That's not what your son needs from you, and it's definitely not what I need from you. What do you need? He asked, quiet, genuine. Delaney considered the question longer than she'd expected to. Go find your son, she said finally. Tell him what you told me, every word of it, and then ask him about the training injury, the real details, not the version you were too disappointed to ask about 3 years ago. Kingsley's jaw tightened, something raw moving across his face. He tore his ACL on a ruck march, he said quiet, pushed through it for 2 more miles, because he didn't want to be the guy who quit. Did permanent damage trying to prove he belonged. And I never once asked him about it because I was too busy being disappointed he didn't finish. Then you already know what you did wrong, Delaney said. The apology isn't for me, it's for him. I was just the stranger unlucky enough to remind you of it. Something in Kingsley's face cracked open, and for a moment he looked less like the man who had stood over her in that aisle and more like exactly what he was. A father, sitting alone in a coffee shop 3,000 miles from home, finally understanding the size of what he'd spent 3 years too proud to see. Thank you, he said, for the 20 minutes, and for that. Don't thank me, Delaney said, standing, gathering her jacket. Just don't be the man from yesterday again. That's the only thing that would actually mean something. She left him there, coffee still untouched, staring at the table with the particular stillness of a man who had just been handed a second chance he hadn't earned and knew, with complete clarity, exactly how badly he needed not to waste it. Cole Boone arrived at the hotel a little after 9, and Delaney heard him before she saw him. The specific rhythm of his cane against the marble lobby floor, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of a man who had trained himself, painstakingly, over 2 years, to make each step count rather than rush it. She came around the corner from the elevator bank, just in time to see him navigate the last few feet toward her, dress uniform sharp, despite the effort clearly required to stand in it, a grin already spreading across his face the second he spotted her. There she is, he said. National treasure. Boarding pass bro's worst nightmare. Don't call me that. Too late. It's trending. There are memes, Delaney. Actual memes. She crossed the last few feet and hugged him. Careful. The way she'd learned to be careful with him over 2 years of visits, mindful of the leg, mindful of the balance he still had to work for every single day. "You look good," she said, pulling back to study him. "I look like a man who spent 40 minutes convincing hotel security. I wasn't a threat despite walking with a cane and wearing a uniform covered in medals," he said. "But thank you. How was the flight?" "Long. Boring. Nobody tried to steal my seat," which honestly felt like a personal insult given the reputation you've built for this airline. She laughed, the sound easier now than it had been in days. Something about Cole's presence always doing that, cutting straight through whatever weight she was carrying and finding the version of her underneath it. "You nervous?" he asked, quieter now, the humor dropping away for just a moment. "Terrified," she admitted. "Good. Means it still matters." They found a bench near the hotel's front windows, sunlight finally breaking through the gray morning, and sat together in a silence that had 2 years of history folded into it. Comfortable, unforced. "I keep thinking about that night," Delaney said eventually. Quiet, the words arriving without quite asking permission first. "More than usual, I mean. Being here, knowing what today is." "Yeah." Cole's voice had gone soft. "Me too. I found out something yesterday," she said. "On the flight, the captain. Turns out he flew medevac. Turns out he was the pilot that night." Cole went very still beside her. "You're kidding, I'm not. The same guy who flew us out, the same guy." Cole exhaled slowly, something moving across his face that Delaney recognized instantly. The specific expression of a man confronting, unexpectedly, a piece of the worst night of his life he'd never had the chance to properly close. "I never got his name," Cole said. "Never even thought to ask. Just remember the sound of those rotors like it was the only good sound left in the entire world." "He remembers us too," Delaney said. "Said he thought about it for weeks after. Never knew if we made it." "Well," Cole's voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, covering it with the particular gruffness he always deployed when emotion threatened to get too far ahead of him. "Somebody should probably buy that man a drink. I already thanked him. Not the same as a drink, Chief." She smiled, and for a moment, sitting in a hotel lobby in Washington, with the man she'd once dragged 300 meters through the dark, the weight of everything ahead of her, the ceremony, the cameras, the president's hand about to place something around her neck that most people only saw in movies, felt briefly entirely manageable. "You ready for this?" Cole asked. "No," she said honestly. "Not even a little." "Good," he said again. "That's how you know it's real." The motorcade, if it could be called that, 3 black government vehicles moving through Washington traffic with an efficiency ordinary commuters could only envy, arrived at the appointed entrance a little before 10:30. Delaney stood at the base of a set of stone steps she'd seen 100 times in photographs and never once imagined standing on herself. Dress uniform pressed sharp, ribbons catching the late morning light, and felt, for the first time all day, the full and total unreality of where her life had brought her. Because 6 years ago, she'd been a girl from a small Ohio town nobody outside a 50-mile radius had ever heard of, standing in a recruiter's office, trying to convince a skeptical officer that yes, she understood exactly what she was signing up for. Yes, she understood the physical standards weren't going to bend for her. Yes, she wanted it anyway. And now here she was. Her parents arrived 20 minutes later, escorted by a young ensign who looked barely old enough to be trusted with the responsibility, her mother already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd clearly brought prepared, her father standing a half-step behind, tie slightly crooked, chest visibly swelling, with a pride he didn't have the words for and had never needed them. "Sweetheart." Her mother pulled her into a hug fierce enough to nearly knock the breath out of her. "Look at you. Just look at you. Mom, you're going to wrinkle the uniform." "I don't care about the uniform." Her mother pulled back just far enough to hold her daughter's face in both hands, eyes wet, voice thick. "I care about you. Do you understand that? Whatever happens in there today, whatever they pin on your chest, I already have everything I need, right here." Delaney's own eyes went hot, unexpected, and she had to look away for a second, blink hard, force the composure back into place before the cameras that were already, somewhere nearby, starting to gather. Her father stepped forward, didn't say anything at first, just wrapped one arm around her shoulders, brief, solid, the same gesture he'd used her entire life to say the things he didn't have easy access to in words. "Proud of you," he said finally, voice rough. "I know, Dad." "No." He pulled back, looked her directly in the eye, something fierce and unwavering in his expression that she'd rarely seen from him. "Not just today, every day. Every single day. Since you walked out of that recruiter's office at 18 years old and told your mother and me you were going to do something bigger than any of us could imagine. We were scared out of our minds, and we were so proud we could barely speak." Delaney had no words for that, just nodded, throat tight, and let her father's hand rest heavy and warm on her shoulder for one more moment before an aide appeared, gently, professionally, to guide the family toward their seats. The hall was larger than she'd expected, and somehow smaller too, the specific paradox of a space built to hold history that still, in the end, was just a room full of chairs and cameras, and people trying not to fidget too visibly. Rear Admiral Thomas Whitfield found her before the ceremony began, resplendent in his own dress uniform, the same commanding presence he'd carried onto that aircraft 2 days earlier now channeled into something quieter, more paternal. "Chief." He extended a hand, shook hers firmly. "How are you holding up?" "Nervous, sir." "Good sign." A small smile. "Means you understand the weight of it. I've seen people walk in here too calm. Never trust that." "Any advice, breathe," he said simply. "Everything else will happen the way it's supposed to happen. Just remember to breathe." She nodded, and he moved on to greet other arriving guests. And Delaney found herself standing alone for a moment near the back of the hall, dress uniform pressed and precise, watching the room slowly fill with faces she recognized and dozens more she didn't. And then she saw him, Cole, near the front, in a wheelchair provided by the venue staff despite his cane, because the standing and walking required to navigate this particular building had apparently exceeded even his own stubborn ambitions for the day. He caught her eye across the room, grinned, gave her a small, exaggerated salute that made her laugh despite the nerves twisting through her stomach. Because that was the thing about Cole, had always been the thing about Cole. No room too formal, no moment too heavy that he couldn't find some small crack of light inside it. The ceremony began precisely on time. Delaney would remember pieces of it clearly for the rest of her life, and other pieces would blur together into something closer to sensation than memory. The particular way trauma and triumph sometimes shared the same neurological architecture, both too large to hold in full detail all at once. She remembered the citation being read aloud, the formal language, careful and precise, describing an operation she'd lived through in visceral, unbearable detail now reduced to measured sentences about extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for personal safety, words that felt, somehow, both entirely accurate and entirely insufficient at the same time. She remembered the moment the president's hand settled the ribbon around her neck, the weight of the medal itself surprising her, heavier than she'd expected, a physical reminder of something that had, until this exact second, existed mostly in memory and scar tissue. She remembered turning to face the room. Applause breaking across the hall in a wave, genuine, sustained, faces she'd never met before this morning, looking at her with an expression she still, even now, didn't quite know how to receive without flinching slightly under the weight of it. And then, near the front of the room, she saw Cole Boone begin slowly, deliberately, to push himself up out of his wheelchair. His hand found his cane, steadied, and with the entire hall watching, with attention she could feel radiating even from the podium, he stood, fully upright, for the first time since a piece of shrapnel had torn through his leg 2 years earlier. Cole Boone stood on his own 2 feet in front of a room full of strangers, jaw set, eyes locked on Delaney, and began, one careful step at a time, cane tapping against the floor in a rhythm that seemed to slow the entire room's breathing along with it. Nobody moved to help him. Nobody dared. He crossed the space between his seat and the base of the small stage in what felt, to Delaney, like an eternity compressed into perhaps 40 seconds, every step a small, private act of defiance against a body that had once been told, by more than one doctor, that walking unassisted again was unlikely. He reached the bottom of the steps, looked up at her. Figured, he said, voice carrying just far enough for the front rows to catch it, just far enough for the moment to land the way he clearly intended it to. The least I could do was stand for this part. The room, already emotional, broke into something that wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite silence, a kind of collective, overwhelmed exhale, and Delaney descended the last 2 steps of the stage without waiting for the ceremony to formally release her, medal still hanging heavy around her neck, and wrapped both arms around the man she had once dragged 300 meters through total darkness, refusing, at every single agonizing step, to leave him behind. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yeah, I did," Cole said, voice thick, arms tight around her. "You did it for me first. Only fair I return the favor eventually." Later, after the formal portion had ended, after the photographs and handshakes and the particular exhausting choreography of official events, Delaney found a quiet corner near a side hallway and allowed herself finally a few minutes of nothing at all. No performance. No composure required. Her mother found her there first. "You did it," her mother said softly, sitting beside her, taking one of her hands in both of hers. "I still can't quite believe it." "Neither can I. I have something for you," her mother said, reaching into her purse, producing a small folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from what was clearly years of handling. "I've carried this since the day you left for basic training." "Never told you. Didn't want to put more weight on you than you already had to carry." Delaney unfolded it carefully. A short letter, her mother's handwriting, dated 8 years earlier, the ink faded slightly with age. She read it slowly. Words about fear and pride existing in the same breath. Words about a mother who hadn't understood, at 18, why her daughter needed to walk toward danger rather than away from it, and who had, over the years since, come to understand it wasn't really about danger at all. It was about becoming exactly who she was always meant to become. Delaney's eyes went hot again, and this time she didn't try to stop it. "Mom, I know," her mother said, squeezing her hand. "I know. Sweetheart. Save the words. Just let yourself feel it." They sat together in that quiet hallway for several minutes, saying nothing else, needing nothing else, the enormity of the day finally settling into something Delaney could actually hold. Her phone buzzed once, quietly, while she sat there. A message. Unfamiliar number, but the area code matched the one from Garrett Kingsley's call that morning. She opened it. "Told Tyler everything today. All of it," he cried. "So did I. He said he forgives me, which I don't think I deserve, but I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to earn it anyway. Thank you for the 20 minutes this morning. I don't know how to repay that, but I wanted you to know. It mattered. Congratulations on today. You earned every ounce of it and then some." Delaney read it twice. Something in her chest loosened, unexpected, the specific relief of watching a small, ugly thing begin, however imperfectly, to turn into something better. She didn't respond right away. Just set the phone down, sat with the message a moment longer, and allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of having chosen, in a small coffee shop that morning, grace over vindication, and watching that choice ripple outward into something she hadn't expected but was, undeniably, glad for. Roberta Voss's message arrived 2 days later, once Delaney was home, once the medal had been carefully packed away in the drawer beside the citation she still hadn't fully read, once the viral video had finally begun its slow, inevitable slide out of the news cycle and into the internet's vast, forgetful archive. "Chief Ashworth, I wanted you to know the airline has implemented a new bias and de-escalation training program for all flight crews, effective next month. I was asked to help develop part of the curriculum, specifically the section on how institutional pressure leads good employees to make bad calls under stress. I used what happened on your flight as the central case study, with your permission pending, of course. I hope it can mean something good. Comes out of a morning I'm still deeply ashamed of. Thank you for the grace you showed me. I won't forget it, and I intend to make sure the people I train don't either. Delaney sat with that message for a long while, phone resting in her lap, late afternoon sun slanting warm through her living room window. She thought about Bobby Voss's trembling hands holding that glass of champagne. Thought about the specific, human failure of a good person caught between institutional pressure and a decision that mattered more than she'd had time, in the moment, to recognize. She typed back a simple reply. You have my permission. And Bobby, the fact that you're trying to fix it instead of just feeling bad about it, that's the whole difference. That's what actually matters. Thank you, came the reply, almost instantly. I'll do right by it. Cole flew back to San Diego a week later, leg tired but spirit unbroken, and Delaney drove him from the airport straight to the same VA rehab facility where their story, this particular chapter of it, had quietly begun. You know, he said, settling back into the passenger seat with a groan that was equal parts genuine discomfort and theatrical complaint. For a woman who just got the biggest honor this country hands out, you sure don't act any different. Should I? I don't know. Maybe a little insufferable. Little bit of an ego boost wouldn't kill you. I've seen what unchecked ego looks like up close, Delaney said, thinking briefly of a charcoal suit and a boarding pass snatched out of her hand. Not interested in trying it on myself. Cole laughed. The sound easy, familiar. Exactly the sound she needed after a week that had asked more of her, emotionally, than most entire years usually did. For what it's worth, he said, quieter now, watching the California coastline slide past the window. I don't think anybody who actually knows you is even a little surprised by any of this. Not the medal. None of it. No? You've been doing this exact thing since I met you, he said, standing your ground when it would have been so much easier not to. Difference is, this time the whole country got to watch. Delaney kept her eyes on the road, something warm and steady settling into her chest, the particular piece of a story that had, against considerable odds, found its way to something like resolution. You did good, Chief, Cole said, echoing, without quite realizing it, the exact words he'd offered her 2 days before all of this began, back in a rehab facility hallway at 5 in the morning, before any of it had happened, before a viral video, before a coffee shop confession, before a president's hand and a medal's weight and a man standing up from a wheelchair to prove, to himself as much as anyone else, that some things really were worth fighting your own body to reach. So did you, she said, every single day since that mountain. That's the part nobody puts on camera. You getting back up, over and over. Nobody claps for that part. Maybe they should, she agreed. That evening, alone in her house, the ocean somewhere beyond her window, doing what it always did, indifferent, endless, the same water it had always been. Delaney finally opened the drawer where the medal now lived, boxed carefully beside a silver star citation she'd never quite found the nerve to frame. She didn't take it out, didn't need to look at it again tonight, just closed the drawer softly and stood there a moment in the quiet of her own home, thinking about the strange, winding shape her life had taken. A cave in the dark, a 300-meter crawl she still, sometimes, felt in her shoulders on cold mornings. A stranger's hand on her bag in a first-class cabin that had nearly, almost, dragged the worst version of that night back into daylight. And instead, somehow, it had led here, to a coffee shop confession, to a father calling his son, to a flight attendant rewriting the training manual for an entire airline, to a man standing up from a wheelchair because someone debts you paid not with money, but with your own 2 feet, one careful step at a time, she thought, standing there, about all the people on that flight who had watched the confrontation unfold and said nothing, filmed it instead, hungry for the spectacle, without understanding, in the moment, that they were witnessing something considerably larger than a viral clip. She thought about the ones who had eventually clapped, not for the fall of a cruel man, for the simple, unglamorous act of a woman refusing to be moved from a seat that was rightfully hers. Because that was the whole of it, really. That was the entire lesson buried underneath the medal and the ceremony and the admiral's crisp salute. Standards mattered, not because they made for a dramatic story, because the alternative, the quiet, incremental surrender to whoever shouted loudest, whoever seemed most important, whoever wore the most expensive suit, cost something every single time it happened, even when nobody was filming, even when there was no admiral waiting in the wings to set things right. Most days there wasn't. Most days the person being told to be a good girl, to move to the back, to shrink herself for somebody else's comfort, had no dramatic reveal waiting to rescue her. No tattoo catching the light at exactly the right angle. No captain who happened, by pure and improbable chance, to be the very pilot who had once flown her out of the worst night of her life. Most days, a person simply had to decide alone, without an audience, without a guarantee that the world would eventually prove them right, whether they were going to hold their ground anyway. Delaney had learned that lesson in the dark, underground, 18 inches of stone pressing in from every side, certain for one unbearable stretch of seconds that she wasn't going to make it through. She'd made it through anyway. And 2 years later, 35,000 feet above Nevada, sitting quietly in a seat that belonged to her, she'd made the exact same choice all over again, in a form so much smaller, so much less dangerous, and yet somehow, in its own way, no less important. She turned off the kitchen light, walked toward her bedroom, the ocean still murmuring faintly somewhere beyond the walls, indifferent and eternal, the same water that had carried 100,000 other stories before hers and would carry 100,000 more after. Tomorrow she'd go back to ordinary life, back to training, back to the quiet, unglamorous work that had never once required an audience, back to being simply Delaney, not Chief Ashworth in dress uniform with a medal around her neck, not a viral video, not a folk hero with a hashtag she still found faintly embarrassing every time someone mentioned it. Just Delaney. A woman who had learned, the hardest way possible, that the real battles were rarely fought for recognition. They were fought quietly, insistently, for the person beside you, for the friend bleeding out in the dark, for the flight attendant, brave enough to admit she'd gotten it wrong, for the father finally willing to call his son and say the words 3 years of pride had kept locked away. And sometimes, she thought, turning off the last light in the house, sometimes the biggest victory of all wasn't the medal, wasn't the ceremony, wasn't even the standing ovation from 40 strangers on an airplane who had for a few electric minutes witnessed something they wouldn't soon forget. Sometimes it was just this, the simple, unglamorous, entirely private act of holding your ground when everyone around you insisted loudly, confidently, that you should move. If you've made it this far, if this story found something true in you, something about standing firm, about grace after conflict, about the quiet strength of people who serve without ever asking for applause, we'd be grateful if you'd like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe for more stories of unlooked-for valor and justice. Help us honor the women who serve, the stories you haven't heard, and the heroes walking quietly among us, waiting for no one to notice at all.